Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Unmasking Leaders, hosted by me, Izzy, and Katie from the EP team. This is a new series of relaxed conversations that seek to ask the questions beneath the surface of the stories most people see. In the world of sport, most top players will say they learn the most from the times they lost or failed, and few learn much in victory. This is no different in the world of business, and we want to delve into what leaders have learned in their darkest hours and what is important in creating change or running a business. Each episode will feature different leaders joining us to give their perspective and experiences. Today, we are delighted to be joined by two special guests, Marco Truffelli and his business partner, Jan Ferris, who have founded a company which focuses on the need to see leaders create new and emotionally safe environments to bring the best from their teams. Our hope is that we will touch on some key topics, such as why it is that so many feel anxious and disengaged in work. So, hello, Marco and Jan, and thank you both for joining us. Without further ado, let's dive straight into question one. Do you think that leaders are open to change and learning how to adjust to a new business environment?
Hello, and thank you. We are delighted to be the first to join you. Such a privilege and such an honor, and already feel the energy that oozes out of your voice. Change. I can't remember who said this, but it must have been somebody that resonated to people around. I said, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. And we're going back to that very basis of outward projection to change, and the need for that change to start within. So when people struggle to cope with change, is because change most of the time feels like it's happening to them rather than them being part of that change. And that leads then to polarizations of views, to fear, anxiety. And in essence, I think that there is merit in involving people through consistent dialogue to ensure that they feel part of that change. And when that happens through safety of the environment, then that safety within can flourish, and people could feel more open to that change.
Thank you, Marco. What are your thoughts, Jan?
I would agree. I think that in any domain of our life, change can be a naturally anxiety-provoking event. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about when we are asked to change, it takes some awareness to understand our place in that change, how we can contribute, how we can, share with others the process of that change. And so, yes, I absolutely think that leaders are open to change, and certainly leaders that Marco and I have been working with are open to change in that new business environment. But it is also being aware that that is naturally an anxiety-provoking process. And so if we are aware of that, and we think about how we can create that safety, create that togetherness, ensure there's good communication and solid process, then we can support ourselves, but each other through that change.
Of course.
Yeah.
Why do you think a gap has emerged between leadership teams and emerging generations? And what do you think needs to happen now to bridge the gap and to create better connections?
Dr. Ferris, do you want to go, or should I go first?
I'm happy for you to go first.
Well, you're talking about the gap emerging. I'm not so sure that the gap has emerged. I think that the gap was always there. It's just in recent times, and moving the thoughts to a different domain for just one moment, the responsibility that social media has in the polarization of views across the world in terms of politics. So you have two camps, one that says, oh, it's all social media's fault. Well, maybe it's not, because there was other media of spreading information before. So I think that the gap was always there, but the voices of the emerging generations through times were more subdued, and there was an order of a social order that didn't enable for that gap to be explored. And of course, in history, we know that we go through highs and lows, and when those avenues of voices are not there, are closed, then things bubble up until one day the jar explodes, and the proverbial genie is out of the bottle. I think that now, possibly during the pandemic, that was the opportunity for that genie to explode. And now we're going through that period that is part of history, where thankfully we do have a better understanding that there is a huge gap, and it is actually a wonderful opportunity to be able to address it now. And then I'll leave you, Jan, with the, so how are we going to address it?
I think I would agree. I think in my generation, there would always be, I would think I would take a different view from the generation that's went before. I think that's part of change. It's part of moving forward. We always think it's different, but there is that opportunity now. I think there are changes in leadership, there's changes in business, but there are much wider societal changes as well. Marco touched on the pandemic, and I think one of the things we've witnessed over the last 10 years, even longer perhaps, is more people talking about their inner worlds, their inner self. And so that is now part of the business conversation. And so I think that when we can more openly discuss that, and when we communicate and lead compassionately, I think we can then take a position where that gap can be acknowledged, noticed, and then working together in a safe space to process through that gap. So I think that's the how we bridge it is by, I will always say, notice it and name it. We notice it, we name it, and then we come together with safety and compassion to try and then work through that.
Interesting, yeah. As we know, young people are seeking higher standards. Do you think we are delivering in business, or is it something that needs improvement?
Oh, what a lovely question. Higher standards. I always see that quest for higher standards to be, it goes together hand in hand with higher expectations. And yes, it is true that every generation has higher expectations than the previous one. And when individually and collectively, when the previous generation or previous generations are trying to put the handbrake on that quest, that is when there is a bit of a challenge. I always try to remind myself that the moment that I start to agree with people that are part of my generation, that is the moment when I've decided to be officially old. So I refuse to do that, and always try to swerve towards the younger generation's view, which is refreshing and keeps us in check. So to go straight to the bull eye of the question, are we delivering? Probably not to the same degree that is expected. But is that a bad thing? As in, if we were delivering already, then there wouldn't be a quest to improve. So this tension, positive tension, I would say, between the higher expectation, higher standards, and where we are, that is the sweet spot of where we can be, as Jan was saying earlier on, to come together and to really allow and reinforce a habit of constant dialogue. When dialogue doesn't exist, that is when the gap is not addressed. But if we can genuinely enter into dialogue and consistently feed that dialogue, that is when we have the opportunity to really do wonderful and amazing things.
There is a lot of discourse that I read a lot online around Generation Z and some of their attributes, and it's often seen as a hurdle. So it's actually, as you say, it is an opportunity for improvement, and that's how we should look at it. Jan, what are your thoughts?
I read a lot as well online, and I read a lot, and I'm always interested in, for example, the Deloitte publications on, the perspective of Generation Z, as well as, our experience in talking to those who would be deemed within that generation. I'm always cautious around stereotypes. I'm always mindful of a them and us, kind of distinction. So I take that generation, that type of stereotype with a degree of caution, because I think it can lead to further division. I think it can widen that gap between them and us, and I think we have to be, we have to mindfully go into that space with all of ourselves, with good self-awareness, with good, an openness, a curiosity. So I think we have to broach that them and us with caution. But when you look at the Deloitte's example for kind of recent publications, I think, go back to your question, do you think we are delivering on higher standards? I think that there are signs of movement towards better. As Marco said, that's where progress lies. Between where we are just now and expectations, that's where progress lies. So, I think there is evidence that we are, moving towards better, but of course there is always room for improvement. There is always room for further travel along that line. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yes, but there's still room to go.
Definitely. There's always room to grow.
Yeah.
Do you think senior players and business have become more focused on profit than purpose? And do you think this has served to disengage people?
Is this a new phenomenon? Probably that focus has always been there. But in the past, as today, and I would say even in the future, is what priorities a business have? Is it that focus purely on profit, or the profit is a byproduct of an investment in people and the product and the standards? Now, one very strong school of thought, with plenty of academic and economic evidence, is that organizations and leaders that focus on investing in people, on products and standards reach higher profitability. Somehow, though, when things are not going swimmingly well, there is the temptation to revert back to just one focus. But let's think about a captain of an airplane. The dashboard talks about, I think, I've never really I've never been allowed to ride a plane, but if you look at a dashboard, it looks about the altitude, it looks about the speed, it looks about how much fuel there is in the tank of the big Boeing 747. Now, if the captain focused just on one of those and just said, let's go as fast as we possibly can, and then realized 3/4 of the way through that they were just about to run out of fuel, I think we would have a problem. Now, why don't we apply that into the business world? If we were only looking at that speed and use the speed as an analogy of profit, other things would fall out, and that plane would not land very well. So I think that the focus on profitability is important to seek growth, but it should be part of a fuller dashboard. And that's where leadership perhaps needs a little bit of help to reframe that focus that will always be there, but frame it in such a way that is part of a more holistic picture that takes everything else into consideration.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Of course.
Yeah, very interesting. Because I feel like if you, a lot of people's viewpoints is if you focus on the people aspect, maybe profits are a knock-on effect of an improvement anyway. Jan, what are your thoughts?
I think to add to that, I think that when there are times of scarcity or times of stress, that what people do is they can narrow their focus, they can narrow their vision. That is a normal adaptive human response. Our brain is wired to do that. But what we know is that whilst in the short term, coming back in the narrow focus might be helpful, in the medium and long term, it's not so helpful, or it may not be as helpful. And so actually, if we can, as Marco says, keep our eyes on all of the dashboards, on all of the indicators, rather than it being an either or, that it is important that we also focus on purpose and, and people. That is, you won't get profitability without, having some focus on your people. So yes, it's to not use just one outcome measure as success. That we have to take the helicopter. Sorry, we're using too many aviation actually metaphors, but I talk about taking the helicopter view.
Yes.
That kind of taking the bird's eye view, all in the sky. Taking the bird's eye view and thinking about, in times of stress, in times of crisis or scarcity, there are risks to that thinking. There are disadvantages, and to try and keep that view of, keep your eyes on the bigger picture. Keep our people, keep our focus on our people, as well as the other factors that create success in business.
Yes, definitely. We would like to dive a bit deeper into the retreat and the whys behind what inspired you to create a business around psychological safety. So are there any specific experiences or observations that inspired you to focus on emotional safety and to develop new environments for leaders?
Wow, specific experiences. In my case, I think is a lifetime of experiences that have created a pretty substantial bag of feelings, emotions, and tangible, consequential experiences that have led to a sense which then needed to be backed up with theory and with studies that says actually in all the environments that I've been exposed to and enjoyed working within, from UK, Italy, Latin America, Caribbeans, US, and back to Scotland, environments where people individually and collectively felt safe to express their opinion, concerns, enthusiasm, ultimately enabled individuals, teams, and organizations to perform so much better. That has been my life experience. But I didn't have the theory behind it. It was just lived experience. And when Dr. Ferris and I met for the first time, we started sharing stories. And then that itch that needed to be scratched found, I would say, the right avenue to fully develop that life experience with the academic research and joining the two together and developing what we're working on just now.
And my background is obviously different. I don't come particularly from a business background. I am a clinical psychologist and had the privilege of spending 20 plus years working in the NHS. And so my journey is completely different, where I have been for many years in a much more reactive role. I have seen and worked with people who experience deep distress. And at the same time as Marco was having, I kind of searched for some of the theory that was going with what he was observing. I was also noticing that whilst it's, sorry, Marco, do you need to go? Yeah. So I was also having a kind of different experience of, whilst it is always important that we support people when they're experiencing distress, if we are only doing that, we are missing a big trick, and we are always catching. We're always playing catch up. What if we supported people in environments where stress was a contributory factor? And so I was beginning to have more discussions and more thinking around, what if we worked proactively to support people develop some of the psychological growth and some of the psychological strengths that can help them live a rich and fully meaningful life, but we do it proactively. And so that became the beginning of our discussion. Marco came with his extensive leadership and psychology experience, and I came from very much a place of a practitioner who was thinking, there were so many changes. This was just about, I think it was during the pandemic, so there were so many changes at a societal level, and we're thinking there can be ways of doing that differently, which then sparked our conversations. And so, I think we have then created something where it has combined both the experience and wisdom of business and, and leadership, and also psychological science. And then we together over the last 3 or 4 years have then shared our passion for psychological science and how can we help people do differently to live and to lead better lives. That's pretty much the driver.
That's really interesting. So with all that in mind, how do you help leaders recognise and adapt to the changing needs of the modern workforce?
Well, every seminar, every leadership symposium has been over the last 10 years. It tends to, everybody seems to have read the same book or the same books, because everybody starts with, we live in a period of change. Yes, we've been changing for the last few gazillions of years. Change is always there. But of late, I think that acknowledgement that we live in a period of change is shifting or is veering towards appreciating the complexity of today's world. The complexity of today's issues is now beyond our lifetime experience and know-how. We have reached an experiential use by date. Monumental employment challenges across a number of industries and professions are threatening the stability and sustainability of global industries, and leadership skills development of millions of people and managers is critically under-resourced and is not fit for purpose. So people are beginning to understand that they're a bit lost. We live in a vulnerable world. We live in a rapidly changing world. We live in a world of constantly increasing complexity. We're going back to that complexity element. And we live in a non-linear world. Today's world is non-linear, but our brains are linear. Our brains are wired for linear thinking. And sadly, most of our education system reinforces that linear thinking. So the question is, how do we get leaders to let go that comfort of linear thinking? Because again, our past experience will not give us the answers that are required to run businesses, actually to run life in today's complexity. And it's only by easing off on that cognitive aspect of learning and to allowing ourselves to use the other senses. So in a way, we start by asking people to allow themselves to be a little bit more vulnerable, and accepting our vulnerability then allow us for arrive at a point of seeking so much more than we used to, just by thinking that we can learn things by reading a leadership book. And I've got the solution here on my hand, because I was at the airport and I've read the latest book on what do I need to do, which of course, after your holiday, you go back to your place of work, and those things are never applied.
So sorry, I was going to say, it's kind of as well about that growth mindset and constantly thinking about how you can improve yourself, and that self-awareness, which I know comes into it as well. So sorry, Jan, what are your thoughts?
I think for the first part of your question, how do you get leaders to recognise it? I take the lessons of my clinical practice. It's not for me to get you to recognise, but to have conversations. You know, it's not for me to tell you what the issue is, but actually to create a space where conversations can thrive around struggle and around growth. What are you struggling with? What would you like to do differently? And for people to reflect in that space. But as Marco says, and then how do we support adaptation? How do we support change? And I think the important part is giving people the space to do differently, and the doing differently is really, really important. So it's not just about reading books. There is a brilliant, Marco and I are both slightly addicted to reading all the books. We have many, many books between us, but actually the wisdom within a book is in the application of that. And so to create a space where change can be through doing rather than just thinking. And I think there is that, in part of that adaptation, it's changing that leadership perspective. What it looks like is that looking in and looking out approach. It's that whole system approach. So looking out is where your leadership focused content is supporting the psychological fitness of your teams and your people. This is about you doing with others. But on looking in, it's where leadership focused content supports the leader to develop a much richer understanding of their internal world and how that impacts on their leadership, their decision making, their communication, their emotional well-being. And so the adaptation is on supporting a change in perspective, but to move towards doing differently. There is a massive industry in self-help books for people who experience distress. There is a massive industry on management and leadership books for people who strive to be better leaders. But actually it's in the application. If the self-help books were the sole answer, they're absolutely part of the jigsaw, but then there would be no need for people in my profession. But there is. So it's the space. The space is so important, but it's the space to reflect, to connect, and to do differently. Committed action. Let's do it.
Yes.
With that in mind, what do you see as the future of leadership, and how will it evolve in the next decade, especially in terms of emotional intelligence and workplace culture?
Starting, the equalizer is to begin with a position of deep self-awareness. And when we arrive or we start with that point, then many wonderful things can happen, and that leads to the next stage of leadership. But if we may, just for a second, we were talking about our linear thinking and our linear brains and the education system that as kind of imprinted a way of learning. And we have a lovely, lovely lady, Amy Edmondson, Professor Edmondson. She's leader of leadership at Harvard Business School, and tells us that the basic human challenge is that it is difficult to learn if we already know. Now, that is the biggest stumbling block, because if we already know, then there is no space for learning. So that is the start point. Now, leadership. I have one full shelf with 5 rows of books on leadership, which are all wonderful. Some timeless, some a bit faddy, and some a mixture of the two. And so there is not one recipe to leadership, and yet there is components that successful leadership have. And it leads to, excuse the pun, to a more servant leadership, where the leader is there to lead, but also to support, to be the wingman or the wing lady, to be the one that catches the safety net, the father, mother figure that is fully in tune with the climate of the organization, that really feels that weather and is able to pick up on those little signs that says there is a little storm ahead. Oh, we have a bit of rambling there. We get a sense of general anxiety in the organization, and are not always the big things. Sometimes are the very, very small things that can lead to pretty important change. So the future of leadership is already our present, as in leaders that are servants of their organization, regardless of what the organization is, for profit, for non-for-profit, NGOs, every type of organization. When the leader is there, they see themselves as a role of serving a community of people that are there to work together, that when we are achieving better goals. However, it comes with a price, and servant leaders are constantly under pressure, not just to deliver, but to support. And with that pressure comes a huge need for support. And that's where psychological growth comes into foreplay, because if we don't grow up psychologically, we are more exposed to that pressure that is all around us and within us.
And Jan, what are your thoughts?
I just would really concur with that we, with different leadership approaches, there are different pros and cons, and there are different costs to self. And so I think, in terms of, the next decade, or moving, for this idea of servant leadership or purpose-driven leadership, is actually to notice the whole self, is to notice the impact on the leader as well. So whilst the leader is looking after others, there has to also be an energy and a focus and an awareness of impact on self, and to then develop some of the resources or skills or psychological flexibility that can support that growth, whilst you're moving towards that more self-aware kind of perspective, You know, the self-awareness conversation, it's interesting, you know, it's become such a focus in leadership conversations. But for me, I would like to see it kind of moving moving towards also including the awareness of impact and how leaders can support themselves and deliver compassion towards themselves through that as well. You know, compassionate leadership is something we talk about a lot and we focus on. And it's to think of those flows of compassion, that it's not just about flows, it's not just about compassion to others or the capacity to receive compassion from others. It's also about being able to be compassionate towards ourselves. That's going to be really important if we are to sustain if leaders are to move towards, you know, living and leading better lives.
I think that's really interesting. I think with the current working climate, I think it's probably widely accepted that people are expecting a lot from leaders. There's a lot of pressure on them all the time, and it's how they can support themselves in that high pressure situation. Guess that leads nicely onto the next question. What are some of the biggest obstacles leaders face when trying to implement changes in their business, and how can they overcome them?
Biggest obstacles, themselves and peers and people that leaders are surrounded by in the board, is how to navigate with the right dialogue and the right choice of language around the boardroom that sees that change, that is not only a change outside of the organization or somebody else's job. It is the board's job. It is the leader's job. So in a way, we were talking about the gap. For me, the gap always reminds me of that voice that in the London Tube says, mind the gap, mind the gap. Mind the gap between what we say and what we do. And the obstacle sometimes is of not doing what we're saying. And sometimes we do so much and we don't share it, and we don't say what you do, but do what you're saying. So important. And to really not paying lip service, just paying lip service to how to address the challenge. Because again, earlier you were talking about higher standards and higher expectations. For me personally, that goes hand in hand with higher degree of authenticity. If we communicate something and then do something different, then people in our respective organization will not take us seriously. What is the biggest obstacle? I wouldn't call it an obstacle. It's the biggest challenge, is to be true to ourselves and recognizing that, like sustainability, we either believe in it or we don't. If we don't believe, that's fine. That's fully entitled to have an opinion, which is just as valuable. But if we believe in sustainability, then we can't partially believe in it, and it's to fully embrace it. So Jan and I have partnered with the Inner Development Goals, IDG, which is a non-profit organization for inner development that works closely with the United Nations Sustainability Goals. And out of more than 1,000, Jan, was it 1,000?
1,000 leaders, yeah.
Leaders across the world, corporate captains of industry, human resources practitioners at Fortune 500 level and Fortune 100 level. They asked, out of all the individual skills that are required to lead into today's world, what is the most important? And I think that 823 said self-awareness.
Yeah.
We have to start with self-awareness. And that leads to the approach that we're taking. The moment that we are realizing a better understanding of our awareness, both inner awareness and outer awareness. That is the moment when that obstacle that you mentioned is no longer an obstacle. It becomes something that we named, and then we can work with and then move it forward.
Yeah, I have to say, I think self-awareness is one of the most important things in probably all aspects of life.
Yes.
I think that's how you can create better connections with people, business improves everything. So, Jan, do you have anything else to add? Or I can see you nodding, so I feel like you're in agreement.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Izzy, and I think you won't be surprised. I think it's one of the it's one of the focus that I have in both my, my clinical work, my conversations with my friends, and the work that Marco and I do together, is actually that development of self-awareness is key to growth, in all domains of our life. And I think, in terms of some of the biggest obstacles, it's when the conversation I have all the time is when we get focused on threat, focused on scarcity. It draws us away from that. So helping people understand what the barriers also might be, so that they can see them coming down the road at them, to continue to develop that self-awareness. When we are in a threat focus, as we say, our lens is narrow. We become more, in the moment, just dealing with the issue here and now. But it's really, really important that we stay connected to that broader perspective, to understanding what goes on in our head, hearts and behaviour, how we see ourselves and how other people see us. This, in the moment, can help us move through those obstacles. So yeah,
of course. I feel like you say, self-awareness is just so important in every aspect of life. I think that's all we have time for today, though. So thank you very much, Marco and Jan, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and insights. It's been really fascinating and enlightening to hear about your journeys and just the important work that you're doing to create emotionally safe environments for leaders and their teams. Unmasking Leaders is all about digging deeper to uncover the lessons learned in the toughest moments. And we really appreciate Marco and Jan helping us kick off this journey in our new series. And we wish you both well with your new business and we look forward to hearing more about it. So thank you to our online listeners for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us for episode 2.